All right, good evening. I'd like to call the October 7th of the City of Hartford Charter Revision Commission meeting to order. And we will start with the roll call. David Grant, I will pass it over to you.
Great. And as a reminder, since we are live, if you can just please keep yourself on mute, it will help reduce noise background. So when I call your name, just please say here. James Wolfe.
Here.
Raul de Jesus Jr.
Here.
John Gale. Alexander Aponte. Aruna Naralampulam. Steve Bonafonte. Vicky Gallen-Clark.
Here.
Kamora Harrington.
Here.
Ken Kennedy.
Here.
Kathleen Kowalshan. Melvin Medina.
Here.
Yadira Rivera. Bruce Rubenstein. And Eon Smith.
Here.
So you are short one member for quorum.
Okay, thank you. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we will have a couple of members that will be joining a little late this evening. So, David, if you can watch for a quorum, we can call for approval of the minutes after our panel this evening, if we have it. But I'd like to move on to item number 2 and the public comment. And it looks like we have a member of the public, Mr. Carter. Do you wish to speak this evening, or are you just viewing?
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Do you wish to speak this evening?
No, thank you. I'm a Master of Real Estate Development student at Nova Southeastern in Fort Lauderdale, and I just wanted to attend tonight just for informational purposes.
Great. Well, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
And I don't see any other members of the public this evening, so we will now move on to our
I think Commissioner Ponte is here, so I think you have a quorum.
hello, Commissioner. All right.
Oh, he was here already. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yep, I'm keeping track of it. I'll let you know.
Okay. Thanks, David. All right. Let's move on to the Board of Education panel discussion. We've got a star-studded panel this evening, and I don't say that lightly. Tonight we have former Mayor Bill Finch from the City of Bridgeport. We have First Selectman Matthew Knickerbocker from Bethel. We have the Honorable Darnell Goldson, a member of the Board of Education, former alder from New Haven. We have the Honorable Liz Brown, who's a member of the Board of Education in Waterbury. And we have the Honorable Susan Glennon, who is the chair of the Board of Education in Milford. And we have Professor Domingo Morell from the Global Urban Studies and Urban Systems program at Rutgers University. So we've got quite the panel this evening, and I want to thank our commission's counsel, Steve Mednick, for putting a lot of work into putting this panel together. It looks like it's going to be a fascinating conversation. And Steve, before we start with Mayor Finch, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to provide some background as to how you put the panel together and what we can expect from this evening's conversation.
I'll be happy to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, and see a lot of good friends on all sides here this evening. The rationale for this panel was to try to give the Commission a sense of the scope of activities and scope of structures that we have for boards of education in the state of Connecticut, as well as perspectives on the role of chief executives, the role of legislative bodies, et cetera. So the reason I'll go around the panel and explain each of the towns and why I thought they would be useful to have on this panel. Mayor Finch, during his 2 terms as mayor, was a strong advocate for mayoral control and mayoral intervention and mayoral role in the operation of school systems. And I thought what the model that actually he was seeking is the model that Hartford currently has. Bridgeport is an all-elected body, and the mayor had attempted to create a body that would have had a majority of mayoral appointees. So he's here to discuss that experience and his perspective on the role of mayors in the process in the Board of Education structure. The first selectman, my good friend Matt Knickerbocker, the reason he's on the panel is, one, he's a wonderful man and a great first selectman, but he also has a kind of dual perspective. Bethel's a smaller town, obviously, than Hartford is. Matt plays a very big role statewide with CCM, with cost, and understands these issues broadly from a state policy perspective. But just as importantly, he spent 10 years on a Board of Education. So we have a town chief executive who also was a member of the Board of Education. I thought that would be a useful perspective for the commission to listen to. Darnell's not here yet, I don't think, but Darnell Goldson is a member of a 9-member Board of Education. Up until 6 years ago, it was the only fully appointed board. It was Mayor Finch's dream board to have a fully mayoral appointed Board of Education. After John DeStefano left office, or as he was leaving office, we did a charter revision. I was counsel to that charter revision. They were trying to expand to a greater group of elected, but they decided to only elect 2. And so Darnell's a former alder who's a former president of the Board of Education, and he serves as one of 2 elected members of the Board of Education, elected by 2 districts that they have. They broke down 2 education districts, 1 representative from each of the districts. And I hope that Darnell actually comes and talks about that experience. Elizabeth Brown, Liz Brown, is a former state legislator, longtime Waterbury civic activist and political activist, and a member of the Board of Education from, I think, 2011 until elected in 2011, served as president of the body. I thought Waterbury was significant. Again, another large city. In Waterbury, the mayor actually by charter, chairs the Board of Education, and therefore has, I think, a tie vote on a tie-breaking vote on the Board of Ed. So that's a slightly different model. It's otherwise all elected by the entire city at large. And I thought it would be important to get the perspective of somebody. She's now served there for 10 years, but has vast experience in public service. Susan Glennon, who I've just met in this process, represents the town of Milford, a town I've lived in for 50 years of my life, in the Woodmont section of Milford during the summers. And so Milford's a place near and dear to my heart. The reason I connected with her, she is the chair of the Board of Ed. She's been on, I think, since 2011 as well, and was a very active parent in the system throughout that time. So really, her perspective as a parent who became an elected official is important, but most importantly, and she'll talk about this a little bit, Milford is one of 2 communities that has boards of education elected by district. They elect them by their aldermanic districts. The other town that does that is Norwalk. And so, and as I said, New Haven has kind of 2 Uber districts. And so those are the reasons for the members of the Board of Education. Professor Morell and I just met recently on the phone, introduced by a mutual colleague and friend in the education policy world in the United States. And he's an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers. What really fascinated me about the professor's background is that he is addressing not so much a structural issue, I'm sure he has views on structure, but I think he looks at participation. He looks at the way state policies diminish constituencies, lead to potential political inequality. And one of the issues, and he's written a book that I am dying to get my hands on about takeover and the impact of takeovers, which Hartford knows from the late 1990s, that led to the current structure of the Board of Education. And I thought Professor Morell had a very fresh and important perspective on the issues of participation, which this commission has talked about. We could look at structure, But is structure really going to do it, or are there things structurally that we might do that would inhibit participation as opposed to embrace participation? And I've asked the professor to kind of be our the cleanup batter, and to after listening to all the perspectives of our speakers, and to talk about his perspective on the role of the public and the impact that structures can have on the public. So that was my rationale. I hope it makes sense, and I look forward to this panel.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And again, to all of our panelists, on behalf of the commission and the residents of the city of Hartford, we really appreciate you spending your Thursday evening with us. And so without further ado, let's kick things off, and we will start with Mayor Finch. I will kick it to you. You have the floor. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, James. And thank you, Steve, for inviting me. I was mayor for 8 years. I was more frustrated with the quality of our schools than anything else I had to deal with. And as mayor in a Connecticut city, I was relegated to not having anything to do with the schools. And there were my kids. We did research. I was the first mayor in the history of the city that we could find that ever sent their children to public schools in Bridgeport, which tells you something right there. Most of the state's school systems are doing pretty well. We have the two Connecticut's. We have the haves and the have-nots. And for the have-nots, we relegate people of color, essentially, to substandard school systems. That's a big problem. So I quickly became an advocate for things I never thought I was going to be an advocate for. I was an advocate for charter schools. I even talked about vouchers in Bridgeport because I wanted poor people to have the same options as their rich counterparts several inches away on the map. My kids, because of their zip code, got less schooling. And I thought that was terribly unjust. And when I looked around to see who was responsible, it was this board that about 9 to 12% of the people would vote for if they were in a good mood. And, they would complain. And then the board, if you got mad at them and you voted them out, only half of them changed. The teachers union had an incredible influence over the system that was difficult politically to handle for me. And so I became convinced that we needed accountability, and especially in poor cities and cities of limited resources. Now, a footnote to that is that there's too many governments in Connecticut. We have 169 towns. I don't know how many governments that would be in China, but it would probably be less than a dozen or less, maybe 1 or 2. So that you can't capitalize on economies of scale. You have to pay a tremendous amount for duplicating of administrative services over and over and over again on the map. So I only mention that because I think it makes our situation for poor people in Connecticut that much more dire, right? We have a system that's so fundamentally broken that the only way you can cover up its brokenness is with lots of money that you only have in about 140 of the towns. There's about 20 or 30 of the towns that are just too poor to give the kids what they really need. If you look at the percentage of budgets for towns, most of it is education. And if you look at the percentage of budgets that come from the state of Connecticut, Matt, you would be surprised to know that you're probably not in that list. You're doing pretty well, even though you get state aid, you don't get enough. I'm sure you could say that, but Waterbury, Bridgeport, New Haven, Hartford, Torrington, New London, a few others, there's about 20 to 30 cities and towns that get more than 20% or at least 20% of their budget from the state. So, Matt, in your budget, it's probably discretionary income of 2 to 3%, maybe at the most. In Bridgeport, it's the same way. So you couldn't cut 20% of a budget from these 30 towns and expect them to survive. So they're only covered up with this largesse that Connecticut has of great personal wealth that we sort of tax and we spread that around. So it's really important that we focus on poor kids' schools. If we can't change the number of districts that there are, which I would love to do, I think Connecticut should probably have 5 or 6 school districts, but that's not probably going to happen. I think we'd be far better off if it did, but at least we've got to be able to give kids who are poor in these 20 towns and cities, we've got to give them as close to the same kind of options as the rest of the kids who happen to generally be white. So I think that somebody's got to be held accountable. I'd love to see Bridgeport be, if we look at just size is so important. Columbus, Ohio has the same things that Bridgeport has, zoos and colleges and all that, all this, the airports, but it has 100 square miles, and Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford have less than 20. We're 3 of the smallest cities in the United States. We have to depend on property taxes. And even with that overdependency on property taxes, the state still has to come in and backfill 80% of our budget. So we've really got to focus like a laser beam, and somebody's got to be accountable. This current structure, when I did the referendum, my message was very simple. We lost, but my message was very simple. Throw me out in 2 years if I get control of the school board and I don't make improvements, because I knew a lot of improvements we could have made if I had the ability to make them. Throw me out of office, because not because I'm a bad mayor, but I'm a bad dad. I'm not fixing my kids' own schools. It didn't win the day because people thought I was taking their right to vote away. They didn't realize that they probably had never voted for Board of Ed. And if they did, they couldn't tell you who was on the board. We take ourselves too seriously in government. People just need a good school for their kids. And I just think that somebody's got to be held responsible. I think mayors should be held responsible. Most mayors do not want to touch the school system. I mean, where else can you, like me, give everyone in the city a 0, give the Board of Ed 8% when they were asking for 18. This is in 2008 when the economy has collapsed, to 2009. I forget what year it was. I gave them 8. I gave everybody 0s, but they wanted 18, and I was cutting them by 10%. You know that game. It's crazy, but people see the headlines and they think their kids are going to get cheated, and they use the kids as a political weapon. And there's the mayor trying to give them 8 and everyone else taking a 0 and cuts in other areas to get the 8. And that's not good enough. So they play games. They're not held accountable for the most part. You don't get thrown off the Board of Ed because this kid's scores suck, because our kids' scores do suck and no one's thrown off the Board of Ed. So, with all due respect to everybody trying hard, it's a system that's designed, in my opinion, to fail. So I think the only way our kids, especially in our poor urban centers, could get what they deserve is to hold somebody accountable and throw the mayor out of office if the kids' schools don't get better.
Thank you very much, Mayor Finch. And we will hold questions to the end of the panel to provide everyone a chance to take everything in and then open things up for discussion. So next up, we have First Selectman Knickerbocker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you, everyone. And Bill, good to see you. Bill and I served together on CCM for quite a few years, and great to connect again. So I'm going to try to say something that's meaningful to the size of the city of Hartford from my small town perspective. So as Steve said, I've been selectman of the town for 12 years now. I served on our Board of Education for 10 years, 7 years as chairman. And I have to say that early in that tenure, my tenure on the Board of Ed began in 1999. And Bethel was not in a good place back then at all. We are a small town. If you look at the numbers, we appear to be affluent. That is misleading. We are a much more diverse community than virtually any other smaller town in Fairfield County. Our demographics have been shifting. We have gone over a 20-year period from about 8% free and reduced lunch to 33% today. So we struggle with some of the same problems that Mayor Finch had to deal with when he was mayor of the city of Bridgeport. Now, from my perspective, we are a traditional town meeting form of government. We have a board of selectmen comprised of 3. We have a fully elected board of education comprised of 9 seats. They're not voted on by district. They are all members at large. And we have, in accordance with state statutes, the Board of Ed is separate from town government in most of those legal respects that I'm sure you're already familiar with. On top of that, in 2007, the town voted for a charter revision, which bifurcated the budgets. So when we go to, and by charter, we also have to have a full townwide referendum for every budget that we vote. So that complicates matters even further. But to the mayor's point, it tended to polarize the town into the people who were pro-school versus people who were not pro-school. But over time, I want to say I agree with Mayor Finch on almost everything he said in terms of the challenges that we have, educating our kids, making sure that funding is fair, We have a real problem with the tax structure in our state, and I'm not going to get into that tonight. But over time, with a lot of hard work by a lot of people, we've managed to build a strong support for the school system to the point, much to my chagrin, seeing as how I helped create it in the last 12 years, the school budget has passed on the first try more often than my town budget, which I find not only ironic, but quite frustrating. But I want to get to the point of talking about control, and I'm going to have to disagree with my friend Bill in this respect. In my tenure on the Board of Education, and I will also say that in conversations with my CCM colleagues over the years, I'm a member of the Legislative Committee. We always, every year we talk about what suggestions we're going to put forward to the legislature, and invariably there's a group of mayors, but mostly first selectmen, who want very, very much to get their hands on their Board of Ed. And in my experience, and of course I had that issue as well. In my experience in this traditional selectman structure, what these folks wanted to do was get their hands on the budget. They were not really talking about accountability of operations. They were not talking about kids' test scores. All they wanted to do was get their hands on the budget. And in my view, I thought the state's wall that, whatever degree it exists, but the barrier that exists between town operations and school operations was a godsend to me, because it gave us protection for people who wanted to raid that budget. And I will say of some of, not all, but some of my CCM colleagues are kind of in the same boat. I remember having a conversation with a long-serving actually it was a town manager for one of the town manager towns in the CCM world. And we were talking about this, and I said, well, your town still has control over the bottom line in the budget building process. This is how state statutes are structured. I do too. As first selectman, I could recommend a budget. I could recommend a school budget to the Board of Selectmen, and then go to our Board of Finance. And once it's voted on, I have no more to say about that. I can't touch it, but I do have some bottom line influence on that. But what this gentleman said to me was, well, yeah, I could do that, but I really want to fix the problem. They hired too many administrators. And this is the problem with chief executive control. That comment might have been correct, but it might not have been correct. In my opinion, as Board of Ed member, I found a lot of it, oftentimes people who knew nothing of our challenges, knew nothing of the state mandates, knew nothing of the trends in education and the difficulty, especially with growing special needs population, which by law must receive certain services. They just looked at a number and they wanted to get in there and take some things away. And so from my point of view as a chair of a Board of Ed, I needed that protection, because we were struggling. We went from a period of time when the year I was elected to the Board of Education, our high school was put on academic warning status by the NEASC. And we had 3 years to fix the problems, or else we were going to lose that status completely. And there were two problems. One was underfunding in the school system for maintenance, and the buildings were in poor shape. The other part of it was academics. So we had to do it the hard way, building support, building coalition within the education community, separate from the town operations, because there was a tremendous amount of hostility between the first selectman's office and the superintendent's office back in those days. I was first on the Board of Education. So we had to really reach to the community and build it from a grassroots level, bit by bit, issue by issue, and over a period of time. And it took a long time. It took us a good 10 years. We succeeded in that. The thing that worries me about mayoral control, if I lived in a town with Bill Finch as mayor, I would say, Bill, fix the schools. I absolutely trust you. The problem is, what if you don't get Bill Finch? I have a son-in-law who is a middle school science department head out on the West Coast. Believe it or not, he still has conversations with parents who are they're still litigating the Scopes monkey trial from the 1920s. And he has to explain to them, no, I'm not going to teach creationism to your kids, and I am going to teach Darwin's theory of evolution. So the worry that I would have with that much control of a chief executive is, especially as Bill pointed out, you have slow voter turnout. What if you get somebody like that? And a person like that, as hard as it is to build support for your schools the hard way that I'm describing, the old-fashioned way, a person in that position can just do decades worth of damage to you right overnight, putting in people who are going to toe the line. And that conservative line. And I do have to say that any mayor who wants to take on Board of Ed in this climate has got to be a glutton for punishment. My hat's off to you. So that's my story in brief. And I also want to congratulate all of our Board of Ed members who are with us tonight. Having spent 10 years through some tough times, I know I've always said that if you could be on your local Board of Ed, you can run for absolutely anything, including president. So thanks for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
Thank you, First Selectman. Next, I don't think we have Darnell here, so we will move on to Elizabeth Brown from Waterbury. Liz, you have the floor. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and it's really a pleasure to be here. We have the discussion going already. As Steve said, I've been on the board for 12 years, actually. We have 4-year terms, and our mayor is ex officio. He can only vote in a tie vote. So this particular mayor is so pro-education. We're very fortunate to have him. But we have had history in Waterbury. I know you're all shocked. We've had some mayors who were in trouble. And I think given personalities and given history, I think the system we have in Waterbury is working for us at this point. We're all elected to 4-year terms. They're rotating terms, so only 4 people run every 4 years so that we don't deplete the whole board. Our board of aldermen, everybody runs every 2 years. We have 4-year terms. It's so interesting because I agree with Bill so much, because we're dealt with a structural issues between the property tax and the segregation of our schools and the inequality and so forth. Those are kind of the big cards that were dealt. But I have to say, from my experience, to be a member of the Board of Education, you don't know what you don't know. And I think to be effective, regardless of appointed or elected, you really have to take the time to build a Board of Education that's functioning and that will make decisions based on the best, of course, the best interest of children, but also based on information. As Matt just said, some people say, oh, too many principals, you got too many administrators, that kind of feedback you always have. So I think the biggest thing we can do, given the structural issues that we're facing, is to really be boards of education with knowledge and to function as a board and really understand what our obligations and roles and responsibilities are. I'll give you an example. When I get on the board, we had no strategic plan. We had people screaming at each other at meetings. I mean, I was like, where am I? Because there wasn't a clear mission. It wasn't mission driven. They were just there to give their opinions. They really weren't a functioning board of education. So I would really urge Hartford to think about doing a strategic plan. Think about really, deepening an understanding of really what it takes to run a school board. We have been flat funded from our municipal side for the whole time I've been on. We all say 157, we're getting 157 million. That's what we get from our city. And our budget is well over 400 million. So thankfully, we have been getting federal grants, and the legislature has really stepped up recently and given us, really good increases. So we're able to look at the quality. But when you're on a board and you have no blueprint and you don't know what questions to ask, it's very difficult. So you show up at a meeting, the superintendent and the chair gives you an agenda, but there's no substance. It's like this is a contract, or this is data. So what we did in Waterbury is we developed a list of what data we needed to be a functioning board: pupil data, budget data, personnel data. So to really start making decisions on allocating resources through a lens of equity. For instance, we have 3 magnet schools in Waterbury who get additional funding. So you go to a play at one of our magnet schools, and they have a stage with lighting or an orchestra, and they have everything. Then you go to one of our older schools. A lot of our schools in Waterbury are almost 100 years old. And God bless the music teachers. They're teaching them on drums. There's no music. There's no microphone. The families are sitting at the tables that are meant for the kids' lunches. So, I mean, it's just glaring, the inequities. So these are the things that we're facing as a board, and it's real substantive. So we've really taken an inventory, did a facility study, and I'm happy to say that we are addressing these structural issues and trying to address the equity issues. But this didn't happen overnight. Our board meetings were just nothing was being discussed. So I think we have to say that as board members, just knowledge and getting the information of what really works is important. And I'm not in favor of mayors taking over for all the reasons that Matt said, but I do think the mayor, obviously, as the leader of the city, has to be on the side of education. And they, and it's political. We know that. Boards of education are political. We run with different parties. And I think that the important thing is to pick candidates who are going to really roll up their sleeves and do the work that's necessary. And our turnout in Waterbury for voting, it runs between 40 and 45%, except in the presidential year. So I agree with Bill. I mean, we don't have a lot of people out there voting and who really know that. But I would say that the biggest really thing, regardless of what you land on in terms of the structure, I think there has to be the firewall between, as Matt said, between the city and education, because there's big conflicts of interest. Mayors they want to lower the property tax. Well, that means less money. Depends on the vision of the mayor, but most mayors do not want to raise taxes, in my opinion. I'm going to raise taxes. I don't think so. So I think there needs to be that firewall. Sometimes mayors appoint people who are just very opinionated and can go in and just wreak havoc on a board. I've seen that. We see it happening now with CRT and Unmask Our Children and all these very volatile issues that boards have to face. You saw the election in Guilford. They ran on whatever they said, truth or something, but they won on a campaign to unmask and all this very destructive kind of negativity that's there. So that's where I land. Our city charter does set us up. We do not run by districts. I think it would be hard on a board of ed to run on districts. I'd be interested to see how that is, because our schools we're not districts in that sense. Not all the kids go to a school in a district. We have intra-district schools, we have magnet schools, we have preschools. So I think that would be very difficult. Although we did move to the Board of Aldermen to run by district, and that has brought real diversity to our board. Before that, this is 4 years now, most of our elected officials were in the high turnout districts, and they were in, very, very little minority representation on our board. And because we are doing it by district now, we do have, minority representation, which has just changed the whole dynamic of the Board of Aldermen. So I think these are the challenges that boards of education face. And a lot of it is because we are creatures of the state. A lot of the mandates and a lot of the way we operate, really, we have no control over in that sense. That's why it's important to have CCM or have Connecticut Association of Boards of Education lobbying and advocating for education and kind of giving us the flexibility we need to make these decisions. So I just think that the structural issues are there, but I think boards of education have to take it upon themselves to function and to really take the time to understand what it takes to run a school. And the most important thing we can do is hire a good superintendent, one that we could work with. Without a good superintendent, the district, there is no accountability. So.
Thank you very much, Liz. Next up, we have Susan Glennon. Susan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. If you can't hear me, somebody raise their hand so I know. So in Milford, the Board of Education is comprised of 10 board members elected by district, 5 districts, aldermanic districts, to a 2-year term. Simply the 2 highest vote getters in each district get the 2 seats, and that's designated by our city charter. So there does exist the possibility that all 10 seats can turn over every 2 years, which is not a comforting thought because as has been mentioned, there is really a big learning curve for a Board of Education. And, if people come in with a certain agenda, it could mean, every couple of years, you've got the district moving in a different direction, so you need to have coherence and cohesiveness for your school district to, it takes a long time to make change in a school district. The wheels move slowly, but you don't see results right away typically. So you need to have that continuity. But while we are elected by district, and there are obvious political implications, such as our leadership structure, we really try very hard to govern in a nonpartisan manner. So the district piece doesn't really, in my experience, has not come into play. Once we're elected, we all sit as a body of 10 and we try to leave our R's and D's at the door when we come in and do what's best for kids based on, the best information that we have. So we do the best we can to make all the right decisions. Occasionally, if there's an issue that might affect one area of town more than another, I have seen the representatives in that district do kind of get a little protective of their group. But generally, the work that we do is for the whole district. So that doesn't really happen too often. I think for me, what's more important is how you govern and what your governance is, what your board's governance is, and that everybody understands the role of the board. We work really hard to make sure that our practices and our basic tenets, the basic tenets are the same across the state. I mean, everyone knows what makes a good board member. Everybody knows that, the board doesn't run the school district. The superintendent runs the school district. She's our educational expert and we hire her to do that, but the board gives direction, the board sets policies, the board does, sets the budget and things of that nature. And as long as everybody is on the same page with that, it really, things operate very smoothly. So in Milford, we have a little bit of a different board governance structure than most towns do. But basically, our governance policies are just like a normal board's bylaws. But we just very specifically delineate what the role of the superintendent versus the role of the board. So there really isn't any question. so understanding, if everybody's on the same page about the channel of communication, so that if you have a parent that comes to you with a problem, understanding it's not the board member's job to fix the problem, it's the board member's job to educate the parent how to go about fixing the problem, which might start with the teacher or the principal before they move up the ladder to central office administration. So things like that. And a board member is only a board member when sitting at a meeting. So these are the types of things that we just really work hard to make sure everybody understands. We, do a lot of orientation and things like that. And the elected piece, when I said to Steve, when he asked me, I said, well, I don't really have anything to talk about because, once we're elected by district, we just go on and govern as a board of 10. And we try really hard not to let the politics come into play. It's not always easy, but, we're there to serve the whole district, and we need to look at the district as a whole. And our decision-making really needs to be done in that manner. So that's about it.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. We will now move on to Professor Morell.
Good evening. Thank you. I guess I want to start by, first, in kudos to the commission for taking this important conversation and discussing, deliberating what's the best step forward for your community. And so you are kind of like at the forefront of what other cities are attempting to do as well. Cities like Boston, cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, who are all in the process now of discussing and really seriously deliberating about the future of their governing structures related to school boards. And this comes essentially, 30 years after this experimentation with state takeovers, mayoral control, that to a large degree haven't delivered what was once promised, whether it was a state takeover, as of course Hartford is very familiar with this, and mayoral control as well. So these cities are, after, again, roughly 30 years or so of these types of policies, kind of revisiting and thinking about what are alternative ways, what are the ways that we should be engaging our communities to improve schooling. So I salute you for that. What we know from the research is related again to these types of interventions that we saw happening over the past 30 years, is that while education itself didn't improve the way that it was promised by many, we did see very negative effects of these types of interventions on communities, and mostly the separation of communities from their schools. And so in the case of state takeovers, and to a smaller degree, but still mayoral control, is that the connection between the key stakeholders in the schools, so whether we're talking about parents, teachers, principals, superintendents, school board members, and other elected bodies, that these types of interventions created a distance between the communities and their schools. And we know from the research and common sense in so many ways that the healthiest public school systems are those that have healthy engagement between all the key stakeholders, right? And so that these interventions were actually counterproductive in that sense. So as you're debating what's the best structure going forward, I kind of think that based on my research and based on other conversations I've had with people across the country who are talking about this as well, is what is it that we can do then if community engagement is so important? And at the same time, as others have been saying, that participation on school board elections is so low, what are the kind of things that we can put in place to try to increase participation and engagement? And so we know from the political science literature, there are certain things that work really well. So for instance, having elections that are on cycle rather than off cycle, right? Like, sometime in the spring on an odd year, right? Those kinds of, having elections on off cycle years decreases the likelihood that people are going to participate. having district elections versus at-large elections also increases the likelihood that people will participate. And part of the reason why is, as has already been said, when you have district elections, it just increases the likelihood that you're going to have people who are historically marginalized, increases the likelihood that they will be able to get members of their groups elected, right? Because when you have at-large elections, it usually favors those that come from the higher turnout districts, those with more resources, right? And so those who are historically marginalized, and in the case of Hartford, what we're talking about here, of course, are African Americans and Latinos, that they don't get a chance to participate to the same degree as others who come from other parts of town. So we know that at-large district elections versus at-large elections may help turn out. And then finally, really thinking about partisanship here, right? And so there is, with good reason, a hesitancy to think about partisanship in school board elections. And the good reasons are, of course, that people want to say, let's separate partisanship and politics away from schooling because we think that this is going to be harmful. There's a logical argument to that. However, what we do know is that when you start to, quote unquote, try to depoliticize education and trying to remove politics, trying to move partisanship away from this, is a process of trying to depoliticize education. What you wind up doing is creating a certain politics that favors the best resource, favors the best organized, right? And so that means the interest groups, that means the teachers unions, and not critique of any of these, it just means that these are the two groups that, because they have the most resources and because they're the best organized and have the most interest in what happens in the schools, they're going to be, participation is going to favor them. And so if you want to move to a healthier level of participation that includes all aspects of the community, including those that have been historically marginalized, then you have to think about mechanisms that are going to engage. And actually, partisanship is one of those things that actually increase engagement, believe it or not. And part of the reason why is when you have political parties involved, all of us take shortcuts when we participate in politics because it's impossible to know everything. It's impossible to have all of the details. And so we rely on little cues to help us determine who is more likely to be supportive of the kind of things that I'm supportive. And political parties do this, right? Now, in the case of, like, let's say Hartford, where, over 75, 80% of the public is probably going to identify with the Democratic Party, it might not have the same type of effect. But what it will do in terms of division and in terms of, Republican versus Democrat, but what it will do is that political parties are among the best mechanisms we have for mobilizing voters, right? Because they want to increase participation amongst, the citizenry to get the votes. And so they are amongst the most effective mechanisms we have to get people to participate. So I mentioned this political parties element because there is a tendency within education to think about, well, we don't want to include political parties, but if we want to increase participation, then we need to seriously think about the role of political parties in our elections. And then I guess the final thing that I would say is in regards to accountability. For too long, and particularly in low income, majority, minority districts, the idea of holding people accountable means often that whether it's a superintendent or whether it's a mayor, when education is not, doesn't turn out to be the way that we want it to be, then we do say, well, this person has to go, whether it's a superintendent, mayor, or whatever, this person has to go. And then the next person, has to start again from scratch. And then we find 2 years, 4 years later, well, the schools are not what we wanted it to be, so they have to go. And so we repeat this cycle. And instead, if we try to think about models that engage the whole community and therefore the whole community is accountable for the schools, it starts to get us away from that one person model, that superintendent or that super mayor or something like that, that the whole community is accountable. And so the ways that we think that we can get to that is by putting mechanisms in place that is going to increase the likelihood for people to participate across the community. So those are thoughts that I wanted to share. If anybody has any question, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Professor Morell. We will now start with, we'll kick it over to the members of the commission for questions. And commissioners, if you want to use the raise hand function to signal that you'd like to ask a question, I will call on you in the order that I see you raise your hand. And you can direct your questions to each member of the panel. And once you're finished up with questions, we'll move on to the next commissioner. And we'll go from there. So Commissioner DeJesus, I believe you raised your hand first. We will start with you.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you for all the panelists that have attended here today. Very exciting and very informative panel today. I guess I wanted to finish up the last panelist with the professor there. He said there was mechanisms that they can put into place so that we can get more community involvement or accountability. Can you name a few of those for the panel and summarize it, I guess? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, the mechanisms are these political institutions, electoral institutions for the most part, that are going to lead to more participation. And these are kind of mechanisms, right? So on one hand, thinking about designing elections in a way that are going to increase participation. So these institutions, so again, having on-cycle elections, having district versus at-large elections, thinking about the role of political parties in the elections. These are all institutions that can increase the likelihood. And then the other thing, aside from that, which I didn't mention in my previous comments, is the critical role that community organizations play, right? And so how do we promote the involvement of community organizations? Because we know that these community organizations and communities of color play an important role, not just for education, but across the board, whether it's housing, employment, and so many other things, that these community organizations are at the front line of helping folks engage, like parents, engage in the political process, including the schools. So those are the kind of mechanisms that I was referring to.
And my natural follow-up to that, do you have any examples of this happening in the city? You don't have to provide them right now, but if you can submit those, that'll be great. Any cities where you see these actions taking place and they're being successful. If you can't answer some of that, that'll be great.
Yeah, so there are some really good examples of this happening. So, the number one example that I would give is if you look across the state of Connecticut and you look at the state of New Jersey, where I'm at, and other states, right? The school system that we consider to be the best school system, have the strongest school system, they usually have an elected school board, right? They usually have an elected school board. They usually have participation across the board that is very healthy in terms of not that everyone agrees with each other, right? Because there are differences, but that there is healthy level of engagement. So that's where I would start. But then I would go into places like, let's say, Union City in New Jersey, right? A district that has been considered in the 1990s, at the same time that Hartford was going through its takeover phase. The city of Union City, New Jersey was about to experience a takeover itself, and it decided not to, and instead decided to put mechanisms in place to engage the community, particularly a community. This is a community that was at the time over 90% Latinx, right? And so they increased their teachers of color, increased their participation at the school board meetings, right? And so this is one example of a city that is now considered a model for educating students of color, particularly immigrant Latino students. And they did it by not engaging in these types of interventions that happened in a lot of places in the 1990s, like takeovers and these mayoral plans, and instead embrace a model of engaging the community rather than disengaging the community.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gallon-Clark.
Thank you. I do have a question, Chair Wolf, and that is, I do have several questions for each of the panelists. So do I ask them all at the same time, or?
The floor is yours, Commissioner. You've always got very insightful questions, so we're looking forward to them.
Okay, first of all, I want to start with Mayor Finch. Is he still here? Yes, I see you. Mayor, first of all, I applaud you because you had an option not to send your children to public schools, but you still chose to. That was, for me, that was a major decision. So hopefully one day, we don't have time now, I would like to peel back the layers and find out what went into that decision-making, but I do applaud you for that. I also know
Well,
that
I'm not mayor anymore and I'm divorced. So those two went into that.
Okay, we will talk about that. But you saw firsthand the inequity. You saw firsthand the poor quality of education that's happening, especially in our urban areas. And so you have mentioned Columbus, Ohio, and I really didn't hear you expound upon that. Can you share a little bit more about Columbus, Ohio?
To me, and let me just say, this has been a little frustrating for me to listen to this because we still have two Connecticut's. And the only city that's really similar to Hartford is New Haven, Waterbury, and Bridgeport. There are a lot of poor towns, but they, Professor, with all due respect, those towns, I bet you that have successful school boards have been flushed with cash and are very less than the diversity or the lack of diversity that our cities in Connecticut have. We have two Connecticut's. And I could talk about the 20 towns or 30 towns that get a lot of their budget from the state, and Eastern Connecticut has some poor towns, but Connecticut chops itself up into 169 little fighting fiefdoms that don't have the wherewithal to survive in any kind of rational, environment. I use the example of Columbus, Ohio, because Vicki, they have a couple hospitals, they have a couple universities, they have a zoo, they have an airport, they have golf courses, they have all the ferry, we have the terminals, the transportation terminals, but they have 100 and something square miles and I have 16 and a half. So I don't have the wealth to do the things I need to do because Connecticut used to give a city to everybody that had a congregational church. You could get a city, right? Well, and that's been a really dumb way to make a state. We have a quilt of too many towns, too many governments. And none of them can really survive on themselves unless the state throws tons of money at many of them just to keep them to survive. But we have a segregated school system in Connecticut, and we haven't addressed that issue. And the reason why I was excited to participate in this is I wanted to tell you this story about when our school failed. We had a school board that was totally dysfunctional. They couldn't pass a budget, and the kids were going to come to school in a week. We had no budget. So the state came in and took it over. There's a process that you can go, I don't forget the statute, Steve can give it to you, to take the school over. And they have the board members have to go through training. Well, the Working Families Party sabotaged it and told their two members, don't go to the training. It'll be a way we can appeal this to the Supreme Court and overturn it. Well, Malloy did the right thing. We got an appointed school board in. We balanced the budget. We gave every kid a Google Chrome. We had parent involvement skyrocket. We had a new superintendent that was appointed by the state, Paul Vallis, a tremendous reformer. He got everybody calmed down and stopped the political arguments about charter schools taking money from the public schools. They don't take money from the public schools. They only have money that's earmarked for them in the budget. So it was all these nonsense arguments that we had. He calmed everything down. And it was because, by the way, Professor, we had a totally detached school board. Most of them didn't even live in the city of Bridgeport. And they were doggedly determined to give our kids the equity that the state wouldn't give them. And they didn't give them equity, but they gave them a hell of a lot more equity than these kids were ever going to have. So Houston is the size of Rhode Island. We have cities in this country that have economies of scale. None of our cities have economies of scale. None of them have enough land or wealth to survive. And that's why it's so important for Hartford to have somebody accountable to these kids. None of us have been talking about the kids or the test scores or how they're doing in school, or what's their social, emotional, advancement, how they're doing with COVID, and nobody's really held accountable. With all due respect to everybody on a board, you can't walk down Main Street in any of our cities and find a citizen that says, oh, yes, my school board is doing X, Y, and Z. They're too busy. There's too many governments. There's too many people elected to office and it's a mishmash. It's a Tower of Babel. And we aren't saying what we really need to say. How do our kids get fairness? How do we get them a job? How do we get them in the middle class? And you know what? We're talking about accountability. It's okay if somebody gets fired. I fired people before because they weren't doing their job. And when a superintendent's not doing their job and the schools aren't doing better, and we have all these excuses. So now we have intergenerational failure. Intergenerational failure. And so some of our parents can't recognize a good school because they and their parents didn't go to a good school. So, you know, I really think we got to stay focused on what's going to give our kids as much justice as we can give them with the deck stacked against us. And I think if you had Luke Ronan, who was responsible, and just to clarify, a lot of the mayors that don't want their school systems are mayors of big cities where they would have to take a failing school system on. And you're all right, it does take time for this to mature and for change to happen. Sorry about the grandfather clock, but my time is up.
You said a mouthful. I'm just going to go on for the sake of time. The next question is for Liz Brown. Liz, you talked about having agendas with substance. And my question to you is, how did you get there? How did you even get to the point where the whole board decided to do a feasibility study? How did you get folks on board to even do that, to get away from just the routine and going through the motions, to really get into the nitty gritty? I'm just really, really interested in that process.
Right. That's a great question. And I think because, and I'll be honest, because we were so dysfunctional at one point, I think we brought Cabe in, and Cabe did an amazing job of working with us. Now, I did have several board members who refused to attend these trainings, if you will, but that's okay. The majority did. We had 8 of us who wanted this to work. And I have to say, out of that process, we looked at our bylaws. We looked at our how, you know, what information do we really need to be a functioning board? So at that point, we had our wonderful Mr. Henry was with us. I don't know if you know Mr. Henry, he has since passed away, but he was this amazing person who really helped us through a lot. So it really was working with Kay, understanding what we really needed to know to make decisions, and to really say, okay, we need to do a facility study. We have 33 buildings. Are we using the space wisely? You know, what's a long-term plan for facilities, for, you know, the playgrounds or the elevators? We just didn't have that information. It was like, oh, let's get a grant, and oh, they need an elevator. We didn't really have any strategic thinking going on. So through that process, which started about 6 years ago, we rewrote our bylaws. We adopted Robert's rules so that we had more orderly. I think I did a lot of point of orders. One time it was so dysfunctional, I recessed and said, we're adjourned, because people were just out of control. So that hasn't happened in a long time, thank God. But it was not easy. It's not for the faint of heart, because you had people at that point who were, look at Bill, you know what I'm talking about, right? You had people who just wanted to be there to complain or had an issue. So I really think that going through a process with an outside facilitator really helped us put it together. And Mr. Henry, really, every meeting we have a data presentation by one of our central office, whether it's special ed or discipline, or so that we have the information, and then we can say, okay, what resources do we need to address that issue? And building on community engagement, all of our schools have a parent liaison. All of our schools have school-based governance councils, which are really great. We have a staff person dedicated to that. So we've really tried to look at the structures that we need in place for community engagement. Our current superintendent has had so many, I can't tell you the community engagement that's going on, but that wasn't always there. We actually meet with the ministers in Waterbury to get their take on it. I think we've tried, and I agree totally that it has to be, it just can't be the schools, it has to be the whole community. And it takes work. It's not a magic bullet. It's taking work and putting the resources into making it happen. So I'd be glad to talk further about it, but I think it's really just to get that outside facilitator and the willingness to really want to do what's best for kids.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one more question because I don't want to monopolize, but this question is for Professor Morell. And first of all, I made the connection a few minutes ago that you're the author of the article that we received, The Effects of Centralized Government Authority on Black and Latino Political Empowerment. That was an excellent article. My question to you is, you mentioned something about get away from that concept about that one person is accountable, the superintendent, the mayor. But isn't that ultimately how it works, that someone, that one person usually is that CEO, that ED, that someone is accountable. The buck really stops with them ultimately. So if you can explain a little bit more why you're saying get away from that notion.
Yeah. So thanks for that question. So what I mean by that is when we have school districts that are, have been labeled as struggling, and in order to get out of that quote unquote struggling label, they bring in this one person that is going to be, whether the superintendent or in the case of mayoral takeover, mayoral control, that person is responsible. We all know that if a school district has been struggling for generations, right? So we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years, that one person cannot fix that in 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years. And so what we need to do then is build the type of infrastructure, community-wide infrastructure, so that we can build towards having a system that serves all students, not just for today and not just for tomorrow, but for 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years down the road. And by focusing simply on that one superintendent, I think it, and speaking of accountability, it puts all of the accountability on that one person. And by the time year 2 comes around and it has not met, what the expectation that has been placed on this person, and we're like, oh, well, it's time for them to move on, and then somebody else. And so that accountability is not shared, right? So I'm not for saying that there is no accountability on the superintendent or the mayor. They should be, right? They should be, because these are key folks within the community. However, it can't be that all of the accountability is on them, because once you replace them, then the community is starting from scratch once again. And for us to get out of that generational type of gap, we need collective responsibility and accountability. That's what I mean by that.
Okay, thank you for that elaboration.
Thank you, Commissioner Gallen-Clark. Next, we will go to Commissioner Smith.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Attorney Mednick for putting this panel together. This is really an awesome group of people, obviously with a wealth of knowledge and experience. So I'm really, really impressed with the individuals that are here. Mayor Finch, I'm opposed to a strong mayor form of government. But I can tell you honestly speaking, if I had someone like you who was advocating for the education of my child, I would have to seriously reconsider. And I think a lot of times when we, as individuals, when we advocate for something, for instance, you're saying, need a mayor to be in control of the Board of Education. Essentially, we look at it from our personal perspective, that passion that we have, that that sense of investment in whatever it is that we are so deeply invested in. And I can tell you that I believe you're deeply invested in education and equity. Unfortunately, not all political elected individuals and mayors are as deeply invested as you. And that's part of the problem when you have someone that goes in there that has their own agenda, and it's not the agenda, is not the community, is not the kids. It's not equity and equality, but they have all the power, right? And now individuals are appointed and they go into the school board, and as I believe Ms. Brown indicated, Elizabeth Brown, they wreak havoc on what is supposed to be something where everyone is supposed to collectively work together to do what's in the best interest of the children. So I obviously that's what this discussion is all about, which system is going to work best to serve our community and serve our children. Yeah, if it is that there was a guarantee that, whoever is elected had your passion, your commitment, at least what you're conveying here, I must say to you that I would probably be leaning very heavily on the side of what you're advocating. But unfortunately, that's not often the case. With regard to Elizabeth Brown, you said that your school district, that you guys engage in, in elections for the Board of Education members, but it's at-large elections, is that correct?
Yes, we're at large, yep.
Okay, can you tell me what is the minority representation on the board? I know you mentioned the Board of Aldermen, but I'm talking about the Board of Elections. How does that work?
On our Board of Education right now, there's 10 of us,
Okay.
and we have 3 women of color, and the rest are white.
Okay. All right.
And as I said, it's about voter turnout, and the 2 largest districts voting, that's where those people, the other people are from, me included. So there is something to be said for, it's, as I said before, it did improve the Board of Aldermen makeup tremendously. And we should probably consider it, although I'd have to think about it because our schools are not in a district, but it's about the population, not the school building, I think. I'll have to talk to Susan about that.
Yeah, and that's my next question, Susan. You know, obviously yours is about your Board of Education. You're made up of district. You have district elections, I think you mentioned. So I was just trying to figure out what is your minority makeup of that board.
We do not have a lot. We have no people of color on our board, I will say. We've had a few people of color run in some of our districts and have not won. So that is a challenge. You know, I would love to see more minority representation on our boards.
Okay. And what area? I forgot what area your Board of Education.
Milford, Connecticut.
And I guess that sort of go to the point that Mayor Finch was making, that, you know, Waterbury is probably more of a true representation of, or likened to Hartford than some of these other areas and cities in Connecticut. Professor, I also read the article. Descriptive representation. That just kept. I'm gonna confess, I've never heard it before, but when I read that, I'm like, this is very, very interesting, right? Because how often do we look, whether it's from an educational standpoint, and we're talking about children, right? We want them to aspire to something. We want them to say, I want to be this and I want to be that. And oftentimes, if it is that we have someone that look like us, that holds that role, that is in that position of authority or elected or whatever it is, it's, I believe, I'm going to tell you from my personal experience, it helps you, it makes you feel like more is possible. So I believe that as a Board of Education, it is important to have descriptive representation, because ultimately speaking, if we want everyone to feel like education is important, because they're combating a lot of negativity, and a lot of people in society are saying, what are you going to do with that degree, right? Well, I could be like, Vicki Gallen Clark. I can be like, Mr. Kennedy. I can be like, they want to be able to relate to someone, as opposed to saying, as strong as an advocate as Mayor Finch is, it'll be hard to relate to him, because there's assumptions that will go with that. Oh, he probably went to a good school, or he probably had this, or because of he was raised in this neighborhood, that's why he got this opportunity to do that. And it may not be true. He may be more quote unquote hood, or raised in a subpar neighborhood, as opposed to me, but that's not really what comes through, because there isn't that descriptive representation. He doesn't look like me, so I don't believe he can relate. But here it is that I have this individual who is very, very passionate and advocating very strongly for equality. So I think obviously, it goes both ways. Just because, I look like you don't mean that I have your interests, your best interests at heart. And I think that's really what the struggle is, because, I don't know how you contain yourself, Mayor Finch, but I mean, your passion I could just imagine what it would be like to sort of have you speak on this issue in front of one of the Board of Education meeting, I believe, is Elizabeth Brown would have to end that session as she did before. But anyway, I just want to again say thank you so much for everyone. You guys, it's really great. I know I don't normally talk a lot at these meetings, but yeah, this panel is awesome. So thank you so much to everyone.
Commissioner Smith, if I can just add a little bit to that descriptive representation part. So for all of the reasons that you stated, this is why descriptive representation is something that we want to pay attention to. But in addition to that, the literature scholarship is pretty clear on this as well. If you increase the number of Black and Latinx members on the school board, it is going to increase the likelihood that you have Black teachers and Latino teachers, Black superintendents and Latino superintendents. And when you have that, it also increases the likelihood that parents in these communities are going to engage with their schools. And that engagement is also associated with some great outcomes, right? Which is better educational outcomes, not just for students of color, but for white students as well. And we see things like suspension rates decrease as well. So there's a whole slew of positive things that come from having increased descriptive representation on school board, and something that we should be very thoughtful about.
You know, thank you for that. You know, I'm an attorney and I do criminal defense work. And I read an article in the Hartford Courier. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it spoke about how minority, Latino and Blacks, first-time offenders, you know, when they go to court, their likelihood of getting convicted is higher than the white, you know, counterpart, right? And I mean, that's just a reality that we know. We didn't need an article to tell us that. But it's sad because I think part of the reason why that happens is the quality of representation that they receive from the attorneys that are standing there before the judge speaking on their behalf, right? That's a fact. Now, the system is not perfect, don't get me wrong. Judges, prosecutors, you know, whatever. But I believe as an advocate, we need to provide prosecutors with information to let them see the humanity of the individuals that we're representing. These 17, 18, 19-year-old kids that are getting arrested for the very first time. If the white counterpart deserve a second chance, get their record, you know, expunged and things of that nature, or get a community service, they should be receiving that same kind of treatment, right? So the representation in terms of going into, again, I don't want to make this seem like, let me be very clear, that just because you're represented by a Black attorney, he's going to go in and do a good job and a white attorney isn't. That's not the point that I'm making at all. But I believe that I live by, you know, but for the grace of God goes I, right? Because I'm a Black man, I'm going to get pulled over on the street. I have many times, because I drive a nice vehicle. So whenever it is that someone comes to me and tell me, listen, I was driving, I didn't do anything wrong, I got pulled over. This is not something that is foreign to me, right? I can be like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Where did you get pulled over? Yeah, that same police officer pulled me over as well, right? So it's important. So if it is that we can create a system where if we have a strong mirror of government, you know, he or she is responsible for appointing a certain amount of Latinos, a certain amount of Blacks or whatever, so to be accurately reflect the community, that's probably one way of addressing it. And again, I want to be careful. I'm not saying just because you're Black or you're Latino, that means that you have that particular community interest at heart. Sometimes people are more loyal to their party and to their own self-interest, their career and things of that nature. But, you know, if you're there, then, you know, there's a better chance from a visual standpoint where children who are very, you know, very easily influenced will look at it as a positive, say, well, look, and teachers will use that in classrooms, say, what do you mean you can't be? Look at this person, look at that person, look at our mayor, our superintendent, our principal. You know, what about me? Who's teaching you? You know, I went to this school, I went to that school. It's important to have that real thing as opposed to some theoretical, you know, reading a book that you can become this and you can become that. And of course, there's lots of data to show how, you know, the country changed when Obama was president in terms of motivation and people believing that they can actually become someone from the minority community. So I really appreciate your article. I really, really do. When your book comes out, if there's some way for you to make that information available to us, maybe Attorney Mednick, and he'll share it. I'm very interested in this.
It's out. It's out. It's been out for a while now.
Oh, has it? So why
Why
didn't I get the title of that? We need to get that information.
It's easy. It's called Takeover. Takeover,
Oh.
Race Education and American Democracy.
Well, I'm going to Google your name. That's just so you know, and that's
Well, I
where I'm going to
appreciate
go from there. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. Commissioner Harrington.
Hello. Okay, that was a lot and that was awesome. Domingo, I am buying that book like immediately. So, okay, cool. That was great to have. And Commissioner Gallon Clark, I want to thank you because you asked my questions, which was like, I checked them off as they were happening. And Elizabeth, the entire panel, thank you all so much for bringing the information that you brought tonight. Elizabeth, thank you very much because again, the questions that Commissioner Vicki Clark had for you, your answers got me exactly what I needed. But Mayor Finch, I'm Hartford and I'm funky old Hartford, so I am very wary of a mayor appointing a board. So I want to know more about that process and how it worked for you. Like, I completely understand your rationale, but when you ran, did you run with those people and were they able to be grilled by community as in who is who and what they were each bringing to the board? Or did you run with the idea that everyone needed to trust who you were going to decide to appoint?
Well, we did a charter revision and we were considering a hybrid board with 4 and 3 or 5 and 4 appointed and elected. And Mayor DeStefano came to us and in a forum just like this, only it was in person, which would be nice if we could all be together, wouldn't it? But we're saving on gas and greenhouse gases by doing it this way. So he said, don't do the hybrid board, do the full mayoral control board. There's another issue we're not talking about. And if the city has American Federation of Teachers versus National Education Association, AFT is a lot easier to deal with, in my opinion, than NEA. AFT is not controlled out of Washington. Each union is independent and they're in a federation. So, and there's no term limits, just like there are very few term limits on municipal officers. So the heads of the union and the heads of the city can make deals, or the heads of the school board. The reason we wanted to go with a mayoral controlled board was, as I said before, I want one person to be held accountable. And I campaigned and said, if I don't make any changes in 2 years, which we made changes in 2 months, once we got a dysfunctional, over politicized board like Liz had, it wasn't reflective of the community, but it was a very powerful board. We had an executive from Sikorsky's, we had the head of Bridgeport Hospital, and none of them were from Bridgeport that I can remember. And it wasn't as diverse as I would like it, but I needed somebody to pound heads and get a budget and get kids computers and have somebody accountable. I think, look, we have so far to go in 10 or 12 urban districts in Connecticut. They're nowhere near competitive with the suburban schools. They're not integrated and they're poorly funded and they're poorly run. As good as everybody is, there's still not anybody held accountable. And so we had this referendum and it was relatively close, but the National Education Association dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars to defeat it. You got to ask why. I have my theories. And they were telling mostly minority neighborhoods that the mayor was out to take their right to vote away. And in actuality, what I was asking the people to do is, you don't vote for Board of Ed anyway. You vote for mayor. I mean, mayor's turnout's about 30%, Board of Ed's somewhere below 20%. So nobody's voting already for me or the school board. I mean, there's terrible turnout. Mine's bad. And so is the mayor in all the other cities. And, where you have wealthier communities, sometimes their municipal turnouts are better, but where you have poor communities. So I was saying, listen, you don't even know who's on the school board. Half the people on my school board right now, there's people indicted. It's terrible. Make one person responsible. And if the schools don't get better, throw them out. Because the kids can't wait. They only get 1 second grade, hopefully, and 1 third grade. And if they keep doing second and third grade over, I had kids that were so far behind, you just didn't know what to do with them. They were in third grade and they didn't even know colors and numbers, and it was bad. And then you put in all the language difficulties, and you put in all the different cultures that they come from. Just like you, we have, I don't know, at one of our high schools, we had 50 something languages spoken. So these are difficult situations with lots of well-meaning people, but it's this all the time. It's this. And you get so frustrated and tired, you can hear it in my voice. I just want to hold one person accountable. And I know maybe the studies don't show it, but listen, I think you should try it. It's worked really well in New Haven. We've even talked about that, and there was challenges to that. But talk to Liz Torres, who was on the board. She used to work in Bridgeport. She can tell you it makes a lot of sense in a city that's poor. And the other thing, you have a hard time finding, look, you guys are all really smart people. I'm surprised. It would be very difficult in Bridgeport to get, I shouldn't say this, to get as many smart people as you have right now on a charter revision commission. We've had a brain drain leave Bridgeport. It's frustrating because, again, it's intergenerational. And I understand from the professor's point of view that you've got to figure out a way to engage people. But in the meantime, like I said, kids only have 1 second grade, 1 third grade. And what I'm proposing isn't perfect because Connecticut's not perfect. But I just think it's the better way to go, considering all the lousy alternatives. What did Winston Churchill say? Democracy is the worst form of government except everything else we've tried. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions, Commissioner? Is that it? Okay. Commissioner Medina, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone on the panel. This has been incredibly informative. Myself, not from the education space, so this has been really helpful for kind of grounding. I had a couple of questions. First, I want to shout out Elizabeth Brown. I'm a Waterbury native, born and raised. Went to Duggan School for pre-K, like the original Duggan, then went to Barnard, Wallace, and then Crosby. I had a question about a couple of things. Elizabeth, you had mentioned that your Board of Ed, as you were getting things in order, decided to move forward with a strategic plan. And I'm aware that there are some requirements by the state of Board of Educations to create some of these documents and reporting about school profiles and whatnot. But it sounded like there was something different you were doing in Waterbury about a strategic plan for the school system as a whole that had not existed prior and that the state wasn't necessarily requiring it. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, absolutely. The strategic plan really was a blueprint for what we felt Waterbury needed to do to improve the school district. So it included.
So you muted yourself.
You muted.
Yes, that was a good description. The strategic plan, like any organization who does a strategic plan, it's a deeper dive into what are the current systems. And somebody mentioned it before. Our hiring practices were not transparent at all. We changed the whole way we hire people. Principals were in charge of hiring, and I know you'd be shocked, but they were hiring people they knew, your relatives and so forth. So we changed that whole paradigm. It's very objective now. We even have parents from the school on the panel, and we set goals for minority hiring, and we have strategies in place. So I guess in all the areas we talked about, we tried to have a plan, an action plan for getting there and where we're going to get the resources. I'll give you one example. When we looked at some of the projects that were going on in our school district, there were 200 separate initiatives throughout the district, none of them connected to any particular thing. So you sit there with this information and say, this is a problem, So these are the kinds of things, you don't know what you don't know. I keep saying that. So you really have to get that information. So we did work with the Center for School Change. We brought them in and really tried to look at, and they did an audit of our schools, which was so embarrassing, I'm telling you. We had a lot to improve, let's put it that way. And nobody wants to hear that, but the board listened and we responded, hopefully. So you really have to be honest and say, okay, we really have to move forward. So I would say getting those outside people in to help who have the expertise. Most board members, I was a former teacher for many years, so I had some idea of education. But certainly, we have people in business and so forth, and we have, parents who don't have any education. So I do think it's not a matter of education. It really is a matter of providing the information to people so they can make decisions. So I would highly recommend that.
And is that something that you think is better organic of each board coming on their own, or do you think a board would benefit from that being written into a charter as an expected requirement? And any a set number of years that makes sense, because you're not obviously doing a strategic plan every year.
No, I agree. And we have written this in our bylaws now. We've written in our bylaws that we must have an orientation. We've written in our bylaws a lot of these strategic things that should not be up to, a new person coming in unless they want to go through the process. So having these structures and systems in place, I can't stress enough, has changed the whole dynamic of the board. Gotcha. Because it's not about personality, it's about where we want to go in the vision. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done. We passed an equity policy that we're really sticking to. We have a new hiring policy, all these structural things that I think we went from 5% minority teachers, we're up to 15%. I'm very proud of that. 40% of our administrators are people of color now, because we said, we're going to do this. And we gave direction to the HR and we held them accountable. And we put money in the budget for the relay program, Grow Your Own. We actually have just implemented the Education Rising program, where we have a pathway to be a teacher. It's a course of studies so that they can become teachers. So anyway, I could go on. I'm excited about the work we're doing.
I appreciate it. My next question is for Professor Morell. I've heard a lot today and reading your article that has been helpful for as thinking about engagement within the community, on cycle elections where people are highly engaged. I fully agree with not shying away from the partisan aspect of education, because education is as political as everything else. But one question I had about particularly communities like Hartford or Waterbury, where I grew up, where these are poor communities where parents often are working multiple jobs, or there are extreme challenges in the household that limit participation. And, I think the myth or ongoing lie in America is that volunteering is free, and it's not. It's expensive, it's costly. And do you have any suggestions about whether it's another jurisdiction in another state, about ways we can support parents of color, or any parent really that is poor and struggling, so that they can participate on whether it's elected or appointed on a board of education? What that support looks like beyond just the monetary compensation, but and for any other Board of Ed person on this call, the barriers that you've experienced being on a board, what are those barriers, so that we're better understanding the total cost of a regular everyday person in Hartford actually joining the school board and being substantively helpful to the process, because they have everything they need to be able to actually participate in a way that is meaningful to them and to the board.
Yeah, great question, Commissioner. So one of the ways that we know we can engage the communities, particularly these communities that are historically participate less for all of the reasons that you mentioned, is two key things, right? One is that the schools are a site of engagement itself, right? Meaning that the teachers are connected to the communities. The parents know the teachers. The teachers are, they're like you. So you're from Waterbury. You become I'm not saying that this is your particular case, but just giving an example. You're from Waterbury. You become a teacher in Waterbury. The community knows you in Waterbury. These are the kind of things that are increasing the likelihood that people will be engaged, despite all of the all of these other challenges that they have. And then the second thing is the role of community organizations, right? So like in political science, for instance, we know that those who are more educated, those who will have more resources, they're more likely to participate across the board, meaning in voting and things like that. But the one neutralizer is community organizations. And these are community organizations across the board that not only deal with education, but deal with a whole set of social service provisions, that these organizations, if they are connected to the schools, are going to engage, provide a mechanism for communities to engage in their schools, right? And so this is very important and vital to the participation of those who historically have not participated, is the presence and the embrace of community organizations in the schools.
And would that mean, do you have any suggestions about how we bring Board of Eds and those types of community organizations closer together by charter? So like, would it be the requiring or reporting of Board of Eds to hold meetings with community organizations? Like, in what way can we create mechanisms that force Board of Eds to engage with community organizations in a way that would hopefully increase participation among parents?
Yeah, great question. I don't know about, and maybe Steve has some ideas about this, and about writing it within the charter to include community organization engagement, right? I don't know about that. I'm curious to see if there's some existing things. The one thing that I would point to is, so there was an article that was written recently by, you probably should take this down if you're interested. His name is Jonathan Collins, and he's a professor at Brown University in the School of Education, at the Department of Education. And he writes about the deliberation in public school board meetings, right? And so he looks at school boards that have different types of arrangements, whether it's just, school board meetings where very little public engagement, or then school board meetings where there's some element of public engagement, like people go up to the microphone or something like that, and then where there is a more robust deliberative process, right? And so he talks about some of these ways that this more robust deliberative process could work. And in those types of settings, we see a lot more engagement, a lot more trust between the community and their schools. So there might be ways there in terms of deliberation and putting mechanisms for deliberation that might lead to these kinds of institutional changes to increase participation, something to look into.
I appreciate that. And thank you all for the presentations. I've greatly benefited from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Medina. Any other questions from the commissioners? Steve, you have a question?
I want to follow up, actually. Commissioner Medina must have seen my hand go up as he asked all my questions. He and I telepathically communicate with each other. But I did want to follow up just a little bit on a couple of the questions, and I'll talk to the professor in a moment about my thoughts, but he'll get the impression from my question anyhow. If Liz, in Waterbury, you've done a lot of things. I'd love to see the blueprint. I'd love to see your bylaws. I'd like to see a number of the things. So you have my email address, if you can communicate that with us. And to follow up on Commissioner Medina's question, let's say I was doing the charter in Waterbury after your experience. And I think Mel kind of asked this question, would you want to see in the charter provisions that mandate the things you have done? Now, we don't want to have a definitive list, and a charter shouldn't be like an ordinance, but a charter is a mandate. It's a constitutional document. Would you want to constitutionalize in broad terms, but specific enough so that your future members, your future colleagues or colleagues after you leave would understand that this is the rock. This is something we need to do. Would you consider adding provisions to your charter that would require members of the Board of Education to do some of the things that you have done?
I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure it's applicable to a charter, a city charter. I think it's my feeling right now is that it's applicable to the bylaws and the policies and the handbook kind of thing. But I would have to think about that. I mean, I do think that it might be difficult to put that in, because then who appoints them? You would have to do a whole rubric, right? You would have to say what organizations, who appoints them, what is their role? I mean, you really have to.
Oh yeah,
all that
I'm
down.
not talking about having the finished product, but I'm talking about putting the mandate.
Just the concept of it?
The concept, yeah, because the problem with the bylaws is the next board could get rid of the bylaws. So if there are principles, if there are
I see, yeah.
principles that would govern and mandate those activities, not write it. The charter should not delineate. In fact, I encourage my towns, Waterbury, I did the charters in Waterbury. I've encouraged stripping charters down.
Yeah, less is better.
Yeah, but establishing the constitutional mandate so that the legislative body, the mayor, the Board of Education themselves can then in real time adopt the policies, but you're compelled to do it. And it's not up to good members, Ms. Brown.
I mean, I think anything that provides clear powers and responsibilities is a good thing. And I think, you know, Professor, I wholeheartedly agree with you about community engagement. And the school governance councils, by law, we were only, you know, mandated to have them in 10 schools, but we have them in all the schools. And one of the members must be from the community. And that has worked out beautifully. We have one school that's such a star. They have the pastor from the church on the corner who sits on the governance council, and the whole church has adopted Hopeville School. I don't know if you remember where Hopeville School is, up off of Baldwin Street. So that, I mean, and I can go on and on, but the community person on the school governance councils has made a big difference. And I have to say that's one vehicle that we have right now that we could utilize and make stronger.
All right, if you could send those things to me, Liz, that would be wonderful. I'd love to see what the template is, what you have done with your bylaws. And for the record, I'm a Waterbury native. I went to Kingsbury School in the Waterbury public school system
Well, we are the center of the universe.
9 years of my life. And Professor, as you can see from my questioning, I think there are things that we can consider. You don't want to get overly you don't want to overly codify, but you basically want to try to do the 10 commandments. In effect, you want to just basically lay out kind of strictures of what entities should do. We've just kind of gone through that in the budget process, where we've tightened up the budget process, become more descriptive in our budget process about the things that should be done in a budget process. And I think the same can probably be done with the Board of Education. Some education lawyers may argue against it, but I believe it's something you can do in a charter.
Thanks, Steve. Commissioners, any other questions?
I just want to say that I sent it. Sorry, the article that the professor referenced, it's in the chat. So if anyone wants to just.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we'll make sure to send that around via email too for the commissioners who were unable to make it. Mayor Finch, you had another comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, one point we haven't touched. One point we haven't touched on is what a mayor can do if they have control of the school board in terms of all the other things going on in the city. You know, we have too many governments, as I said that, but we also, within each town or city, we have two governments. One is the Board of Ed, and one is the city government. In the cities, the budget's about 50-50. In the suburbs, it's about 80-20. But in any case, the mayor or the first selectman runs a library system, a park system, a recreation system, all separate and apart from the schools. And the schools do the same thing, all separate and apart from the city. I was in the process of trying to combine the library system so that the communities would each have access through separate doors to their school, in many cases, to their school neighborhoods where it was appropriate, their libraries. We built new parks around the schools. We did millions and millions of dollars of improvement to the parklands that were adjacent or on the schools were built on the parks. So we combined the two public works departments so that the city could capitalize on economies of scale, and the money we saved, we went to the schools. We did energy conservation in all the schools. It was stormwater diversion, all kinds of things, tree planting. And every time we saved money that we could calculate, we let the schools keep the savings because they'd never really had much motive to do these things other than it was a good thing to do because the city would just grab this money, but we let them keep the savings. So when a mayor has control, you can have one government for the town or the city rather than two. And it doesn't make any sense to have two. It's just the way our states decided to do it. I think it's ridiculous, but in any case, when you go with a mayor control, they can do all these other things. You know, recreation departments can be combined with the schools. And the kids are all better off. And that's what it's really about. So there's all these other things a mayor can do if they control the school board. You can't do it. The school boards won't do it with a strong mayor form of government. There's too many politics. And then you've got to get, 5 votes out of 9 on the school board, and a mayor can just do it.
Thank you, Mayor Finch. Commissioner Gallon Clark.
Just real quick, would any of you just share briefly any best practices that you've experienced or seen to bring the Board of Ed and the City Council closer together, working more coherently together? I'm seeing you, Matt Knickerbocker.
Thank you for that question. That's a good one. As I've been listening to the discussion tonight, I was thinking back. It's going on over 20 years now since I was first elected to the Board of Ed. There are several points I want to make that really resonated with me. One, Professor Morell pointed out that political parties are integral to the process because they drive votes. They can galvanize voters, motivate them, and it can get them to the polls. And my experience is that is exactly right. When we talk as Board of Ed members about leaving politics at the door, I think that it was more of a reference to leaving our personal agendas at the door. The political part of motivating people is absolutely critical. And the way we got out of our crisis back in the late 90s, when our high school was about to lose its accreditation, we had failing buildings, we had a $20,000 grand piano that had been donated by a group that was destroyed by a leaky roof. It became a point of a campaign to where one political party, in our case, the Democratic Party in the town of Bethel, formed a core of possible candidates, and we campaigned on that issue, and we worked very hard. And ironically, the NEASC sealed our victory because when the threat to our accreditation hit the newspaper, that finally woke up the town. They were not paying attention. They had plenty of bad things to say. It's one of those things where when the news is bad, people get a negative attitude and they don't see beyond that and they don't see what the possibilities are. So that was our entree. And we did win. Every one of our candidates won that election. We set about building that accountability that Mayor Finch was talking about. Now, here's another thing that we put in place several years later. I'm going to guess about 4 years later. At that time, I was chair. We had a retirement in our senior ranks. Our assistant superintendent retired. So when we went looking for her replacement, we specifically went for somebody who could help us set up an education foundation. And now an education foundation, many towns have them today. They are not political entities. They're not designed to be political. They don't want to be political, and we try to keep them out of the politics. But what it did was it created programs where parents could come in and make donations to do certain things, like to get those whiteboards we didn't used to have, to buy Chromebooks for a class. We even gave the kids in the high school the ability to nominate their teachers for awards. And what that did was it coalesced an awareness in the community of what our schools do and what their needs are. So it was almost like a political message that came in the back door. Never intended to be that way, but I really credit that to the tremendous acceleration of involvement that we got after we started that foundation. So if any of you, now this of course has nothing to do with our discussion about charters, but it was something that really made an enormous difference in how our community viewed our schools and how they treated them. And we've really been on an upward trajectory since then.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments from our panel?
I just want to add one thing. I want to agree with Mayor Finch here on, the existing inequities in the state of Connecticut and how that needs to be addressed. And so this is, I think, another reason why it's important to have community engagement and school boards that are connected to the community, because what we know is that in order to improve the resources, increase the resources for the schools, these communities, as he stated clearly, these cities can't do it on their own. Bridgeport can't do it on its own. Waterbury can't do it on its own. Hartford will not be able to do it on its own. So you need the state to come in and step in when it comes to resources. And those resources are not, the state is not going to willingly just do this, right? They have to fight for it. And one of the ways that this happens is by having a politically mobilized community, beginning with the school board and community members who are engaged throughout on all levels of education to go and fight for these resources through lawsuits, but also at the state legislature, right? And so, I agree with him up to that point, because the one thing that I would disagree with is that the members of the school board that he had in Bridgeport are not exactly those that are going to be knocking on on the front of the steps of the state legislature demanding for more resources for the city of Bridgeport, right? It's the communities, the people in Bridgeport, particularly those members of color who are the ones who are most affected by this. They are the ones that are more likely to be the fighters for these resources in Bridgeport, Hartford, and other places, right? So just wanted to add that about the importance of school boards in that sense.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, we're a little bit over time, so I do want to end questions now, but I just really want to thank you again, everyone here on the panel tonight. This was incredibly informative, and I'm sure that there will be follow-up questions, so I hope you won't mind if Attorney Mednick sends around some follow-up questions or requests for additional information that can help inform our conversations going forward, because I'm sure there will be some additional inquiries. And with that, thank you. I want to quickly move back to item number 3 on our agenda, and the approval of the minutes from September 20th, 21, and I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Seconded.
The motion's been made and properly seconded. Any discussion?
All right.
Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it, and the motion carries. And without objection, we will stand adjourned at 8:52. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
It's a
Great
pleasure.
job. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.